There is a quiet crisis unfolding that most people refuse to talk about honestly. And it is not happening in the shadows, it is happening in plain sight, in offices, apartments, empty homes, and long silent nights. Millions of women were told to delay family, delay commitment, delay building something lasting because there would always be time later, and now later has arrived with consequences that no one prepared them for. Stay with me to the end of this video because what we are going to unpack here explains not only what is happening now, but where this is heading next and why the consequences are accelerating faster than anyone expected. And if you find value in content like this, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell and select all so you never miss an upload. That helps this channel grow and it ensures you get every Angry Guy video the moment it goes live. Before we go any further, I want to tell you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy. If you want to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth in a world that is becoming more unstable by the day, the Academy teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly and strategically. The link to Angry's Crypto Academy is in the description of this video, so go check it out now while you are thinking about it. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. That support goes directly into keeping this channel running and producing more content like this. Now, let us get into the heart of what is happening because this is not about mockery. And it is not about celebrating anyone's hardship. It is about confronting a reality that has been carefully hidden behind slogans, narratives, and promises that never had to be honored. For decades, women were told that the traditional path was optional, that family could wait, that children were a burden rather than a blessing, and that fulfillment would be found primarily through career status, credentials, and independence from men. This message did not come from one place. It came from schools, from media, from corporate culture, from political movements, and even from parents who genuinely believed they were helping their daughters succeed in a modern world. The problem is not that women were encouraged to pursue, the education or careers. The problem is that they were never told about trade-offs, timelines, or biological reality, and they were never told that some doors do not reopen once they close. What we are witnessing now is the result of that omission. Large numbers of women delayed family formation into their 30s and 40s, believing that options would remain abundant, only to discover that the social, relational, and biological landscape had shifted beneath their feet. Fertility declines, dating pools shrink, men who once would have pursued long-term relationships opt out entirely. Communities that once formed naturally around families and shared responsibility dissolve into isolated individuals navigating life alone. This is not theory. It is measurable in birth rates, marriage rates, mental health data, and economic stress indicators across the developed world. For years, men were told they were unnecessary, replaceable, and even harmful by default. Many listened. They stepped back. They disengaged. They stopped initiating. They stopped offering protection, provision, and leadership because they were explicitly told those things were no longer wanted. Now, as the absence of those contributions becomes impossible to ignore, society is struggling to explain why so many women feel unsupported, anxious, and uncertain about the future. You cannot remove a structural pillar from a building and then act surprised when the roof begins to sag. One of the most difficult truths to accept is that systems do not care about individual outcomes. Movements promise liberation, empowerment, and choice, but systems only respond to incentives. When women entered the workforce en masse, labor supply doubled, wages stagnated, and dual incomes became mandatory rather than optional for survival. What was framed as freedom quietly became obligation. What was sold as independence became dependence on employers, institutions, and eventually the state. The promise was that women would gain control over their lives. The reality is that many traded one form of reliance for another that is are colder, more bureaucratic, and far less forgiving. There is also a cultural reluctance to talk honestly about differences in priorities and psychology. Men and women are not identical in how they approach time, risk, relationships, and long term planning. Many women were encouraged to prioritize immediate fulfillment and personal experience without equal emphasis on delayed consequences. When accountability is postponed long enough, it does not disappear. It accumulates, it compounds, and when it finally arrives, it arrives all at once. We are seeing that moment now as increasing numbers of women realize that the outcomes they were promised were conditional on assumptions that never held true. This situation is made worse by the breakdown of trust between men and women. When communication becomes adversarial, when motives are questioned by default, and when entire groups are spoken about as problems rather than partners, cooperation collapses. Men increasingly respond not with confrontation, but with withdrawal. They opt out of dating, opt out of marriage, opt out of mentorship, and opt out of social spaces where the risks outweigh the rewards. This is not revenge, it is risk management. When the cost of engagement becomes unpredictable, disengagement becomes rational. We can see the effects of this withdrawal across multiple sectors. Social venues that once depended on male participation struggle to survive. Dating ecosystems dry up, professional environments become more transactional and less relational. Informal support systems that once helped individuals weather hardship disappear, leaving people more exposed to institutional control. When men step away from informal leadership and protection roles, the vacuum is filled by policies, regulations, and systems that are indifferent to individual well being. And this brings us to another uncomfortable reality. As personal relationships weaken, the role of centralized authority expands. When people lack families, communities, and mutual dependence, they turn to institutions for security. Institutions are happy to provide assistance, but always with conditions. Assistance becomes leverage. Leverage becomes control. Many women believed they were gaining autonomy, but in practice, they became more reliant on structures that monitor, regulate, and limit their choices. This trade was never explained honestly because it sounds far less appealing when stated plainly. Economic pressure intensifies this dependence. Debt burdens, particularly student debt, lock people into jobs they cannot leave and lifestyles they cannot sustain alone. Promises of upward mobility fade as costs rise faster than wages. When combined with delayed family formation, the result is a generation of individuals who are overworked, undersupported, and increasingly anxious about aging without a safety net. Men once served as a stabilizing force in this equation, not because they were perfect, but because shared responsibility distributes risk. Remove that sharing, and the load becomes unbearable. There is also the matter of intimacy and long term bonding. Human beings are not designed for endless novelty without consequence. Repeated short term connections can undermine the ability to form deep, lasting bonds. This affects trust, satisfaction, and long term relationship stability. When people reach a stage in life where they desire permanence, they may find that the emotional infrastructure required to sustain it has been eroded. This is not punishment, it is cause and effect. Across the world, we see similar patterns emerging in different cultural contexts. In places where men feel particularly targeted or constrained by social rules, withdrawal accelerates. When engagement carries legal, professional, or reputational risk, rational actors minimize exposure. This creates artificial scarcity in relationships and social interaction. Women are told to wait for men to approach, while men are incentivized not to. The result is paralysis, frustration, and mutual resentment that benefits no one except systems that thrive on division. The most troubling aspect of all this is that many women were never given informed consent. They were encouraged to make irreversible decisions without full information. They were assured that biology could be negotiated with technology, that social dynamics could be reshaped without resistance, and that men would adapt indefinitely. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. None of those assumptions proved reliable. Now, as reality asserts itself, there is a rush to assign blame rather than responsibility. Blame does not rebuild trust. Responsibility is the only path forward, but it requires honesty that many institutions are unwilling to provide. What makes this moment particularly severe is timing. Advances in automation and artificial intelligence are restructuring labor markets rapidly. Roles that once provided stable income and identity are disappearing or transforming. Support systems are strained. Governments are financially overextended. In this environment, individuals without strong personal networks face increasing vulnerability. Men, responding to these pressures, are building parallel paths that minimize exposure to centralized systems. Those paths often rely on informal trust networks that are difficult to access without long standing relationships. As men retreat into these structures, women who are excluded find themselves with fewer options and higher barriers to entry. None of this is happening because men secretly planned to cause harm. It is happening because incentives shape behavior. When cooperation is punished and withdrawal is safer, withdrawal becomes widespread. When long term investment in relationships is discouraged, short term thinking dominates until the long term arrives and finds everyone unprepared. The tragedy is not that women pursued opportunity. The tragedy is that they were never told the full cost, and now many are paying it alone. This is where the conversation must shift from slogans to solutions, from emotion to analysis, and from denial to adaptation. The future will not be built on pretending this crisis does not exist. It will be built by those willing to understand incentives, accept responsibility, and rebuild trust where possible. That process will not be comfortable, and it will not be evenly distributed. Some outcomes are already locked in, but ignoring reality will only make the landing harder. As we continue, we are going to explore how this dynamic affects culture, economics, relationships, and individual choice going forward. We are going to talk about what can still be done, what cannot be undone, and why the next decade will separate those who adapt from those who cling to narratives that no longer work. Stay with me because the next part connects everything you are seeing now to what comes next and why this moment is far more pivotal than most people realize. To understand where this situation is heading, you have to stop looking at it as a moral debate and start looking at it as a structural one. Societies are machines built on incentives, feedback loops, and human behavior. When you change one input, you change the output, whether you like the result or not. For decades, the messaging aimed at women focused almost exclusively on expanding choice in the short term, while downplaying responsibility and long term consequence. Choice without consequence sounds liberating, but in reality, it is a lie, because consequences do not disappear simply because someone refuses to acknowledge them. They wait, they compound, and then they arrive when it is most inconvenient, when energy is lower, Options are fewer, and recovery is harder. One of the most damaging myths sold over the last 50 years is that time is neutral. It is not. Time favors those who plan early and penalizes those who postpone foundational decisions. Men and women both age, but the effects are not symmetrical. This is not about judgment, it is about biology and social dynamics. When women were told they could simply reverse decisions later or that technology would erase natural limits, they were being reassured, not informed. Reassurance feels good in the moment, but it is worthless when reality arrives and does not care how comforting the message once was. As women delayed family formation, another change occurred quietly alongside it. Men adapted. They recalibrated their expectations, their behavior, and their willingness to participate in systems that increasingly treated them as expendable. Men did not hold a meeting and decide to withdraw. They responded individually to incentives that made engagement risky and disengagement safer. Over time, individual decisions formed a pattern, and that pattern became a trend. Today, fewer men are willing to take on long term responsibility without clear benefit and mutual respect. This is not hostility, it is calculation. When trust erodes, people stop investing. Relationships are investments of time, resources, and emotional energy. If the expected return is uncertainty, conflict, or loss, rational actors reduce exposure. This is exactly what we are seeing. Men are no longer eager to initiate, to mentor, or to support without safeguards. This has cascading effects that go far beyond dating. It affects workplace dynamics, community cohesion, and informal support networks that once softened the harsh edges of life. At the same time, women are discovering that independence does not mean insulation from risk. In many cases, it means absorbing all of it alone. Careers that once seemed stable are vulnerable to restructuring. Credentials that required years of effort no longer guarantee security. Social networks built around work dissolve quickly when employment ends. Without family or long term partnership, there is no buffer, no shared load, no one to catch the fall. This reality is hitting hardest for those who believe that independence itself was a safety net. Another layer of this crisis lies in how modern culture treats intimacy and commitment. Constant emphasis on self expression and personal freedom has made permanence feel restrictive rather than stabilizing. Commitment is framed as sacrifice rather than investment. The result is a generation skilled at beginning things and unprepared for sustaining them. When novelty fades, there is no framework for endurance. When conflict arises, there is no patience for repair. Over time, this erodes confidence in long term partnership itself, making it harder to choose, even when the desire for stability finally emerges. What makes this especially painful is that many women reach this realization at a point when rebuilding is difficult. Energy has been spent, opportunities have narrowed. Social circles are fragmented. Meanwhile, men of similar age who opted out earlier may be financially stable, emotionally detached, and uninterested in re entering the system that once rejected them. This mismatch creates frustration on both sides, but only one side was told that this outcome would never happen. We also need to talk about how institutions benefit from this fragmentation. Individuals without strong personal bonds are easier to manage. They are more dependent on systems for security, validation, and survival. When families weaken and communities dissolve, centralized authority expands naturally to fill the gap. This is not conspiracy, it is history. Power flows to wherever people turn in times of need. When people cannot rely on each other, they rely on institutions. And institutions always come with conditions. Many women believed that aligning with large systems would offer protection. In reality, systems protect themselves first. Support is transactional, temporary, and contingent on compliance. When resources are abundant, assistance feels generous. When resources are scarce, assistance becomes restrictive. We are entering a period where scarcity is becoming the norm, not the exception. Financial pressure, demographic imbalance, and technological disruption are converging. In that environment, those without personal support networks face increasing vulnerability. Men, observing this trajectory, are not rushing to intervene. They are building alternatives, smaller networks, skill based exchanges, decentralized cooperation that does not rely on permission or approval. These structures are not designed to exclude women out of spite, they are designed to minimize risk. Entry requires trust, contribution, and shared values. For many women who have been socialized to expect access without obligation, these environments feel closed off. The barrier is not hostility, it is expectation. This leads to a painful paradox. The very movements that promised women freedom from reliance on men have made reliance on systems unavoidable. The autonomy that was advertised has been replaced by oversight, regulation, and surveillance justified in the name of safety and fairness. Many women supported these measures, believing they would never be used against them. Now they are discovering that rules do not distinguish between friend and foe. Control is impersonal. Once established, it applies to everyone. Economic data already reflects this shift. Increasing numbers of women are financially insecure despite higher levels of education than any previous generation. Debt burdens limit mobility. Housing costs isolate individuals. Health outcomes worsen under chronic stress. Mental well being declines when life feels directionless and unsupported. These are not individual failures, they are systemic outcomes of choices made at scale, reinforced by narratives that discourage caution and long term planning. The response from mainstream culture has been to deny or deflect. Critics are labeled negative or outdated. Conversations are shut down rather than examined. But silence does not solve structural problems, it only delays adaptation. The people who will fare best in the coming years are not those who cling to comforting stories, but those who adjust to reality as it is, not as it was promised to be. This is where personal responsibility re enters the conversation, not as blame, but as agency. Responsibility is the ability to respond, it is recognizing limits, adjusting behavior, and making choices that align with long term outcomes rather than short term comfort. For many women, this will require confronting uncomfortable truths about time, relationships, and priorities. For many men, it means maintaining boundaries while deciding where cooperation is still worthwhile. None of this implies that cooperation between men and women is impossible. It implies that it cannot be rebuilt on denial. Trust must be earned. Expectations must be realistic. Roles must be negotiated honestly rather than imposed ideologically. That process is slower and more difficult than slogans, but it is the only path that leads somewhere stable. As we look ahead, the divide between those who adapt and those who do not will widen. Some women will recalibrate early enough to build meaningful partnerships and communities. Others will remain trapped between narratives that no longer deliver and systems that do not care. Some men will re engage selectively, while others will remain withdrawn, focusing on self preservation and small trusted circles. The era of broad social cohesion is giving way to fragmentation, and fragmentation rewards foresight. This is why the next decade matters so much. Demographic trends are not reversing quickly. Economic pressures are intensifying. Cultural trust is low. In this environment, decisions made now carry amplified consequences. Waiting for validation from institutions or culture will leave many behind. The window for rebuilding is not closed, but it is narrowing, and it favors those willing to act decisively. What many people are struggling to grasp is that the shift did not begin with hostility, and it did not begin with resentment. It began with confusion. For a long time, men and women were given incompatible instructions about how to live meaningful lives, and both were assured that everything would somehow work itself out. Men were told to step aside, to soften, to defer, and to accept blame for outcomes they did not control. Women were told to prioritize themselves above all else, to delay commitment indefinitely, and to believe that stability would always be available on demand. When those two sets of instructions collided, the result was not harmony, but drift. People moved in different directions while assuming they were still walking the same road. Drift is dangerous because it is slow. You do not feel it happening day to day. You only notice it when you look back and realize how far apart things have become. By the time many women realized that the landscape had changed, the social infrastructure that once supported family formation had already weakened. Churches, neighborhoods, extended families, and informal community ties no longer play the role they once did. In the absence of those structures, individuals are expected to navigate complex emotional and economic realities entirely on their own, while being told that needing help is a sign of weakness. But these men observing this environment adapted in ways that were quiet but decisive. They reduced risk exposure. They simplified their lives. They focused on controllable variables like health, skills, savings, and autonomy. Many stopped trying to convince anyone of their value and instead chose to live in ways that required less validation. This shift was not dramatic or public, it was personal. And when enough individuals make the same adjustment, the culture changes whether anyone approves of it or not. One of the clearest signs of this change is how social interaction itself has been redefined. Where there was once a presumption of goodwill, there is now caution. Where there was once openness, there is now calculation. Men are increasingly aware that intentions can be misinterpreted and that misunderstandings can carry serious consequences. In response, they limit interaction to what is necessary and predictable. This reduces conflict, but it also reduces connection. The unintended consequence is a colder social environment where people coexist without truly engaging. Women often interpret this withdrawal as rejection or hostility, but from the male perspective, it is self protection. When the cost of being wrong is high and the reward for being right is low, restraint becomes the default. Over time, this restraint becomes habit, and habit becomes identity. Men stop seeing themselves as participants in a shared social project and instead view society as something to navigate carefully rather than invest in deeply. This creates a feedback loop. As men withdraw, women experience less engagement and feel less desired or supported. In response, some double down on narratives that frame men as the problem, which further discourages male participation. Others feel confused and isolated, sensing that something is wrong, but lacking the language to articulate it. Meanwhile, institutions step in to fill the relational void with programs, policies, and messaging that promise security but deliver dependency. Another aspect that rarely gets discussed honestly is how modern success metrics distort priorities. Achievement is measured in titles, income, and visibility rather than stability, continuity, and contribution. Many women were encouraged to pursue markers of success that are inherently competitive and individualistic, while being told that relational fulfillment would simply follow. When it did not, the disconnect was blamed on external factors rather than flawed assumptions. It is difficult to course correct when admitting error feels like admitting failure. The psychological toll of this environment is significant. Chronic stress, anxiety, and dissatisfaction are rising not because people are incapable, but because they are unsupported. Humans are social creatures. We are not designed to carry every burden alone. When systems encourage isolation under the guise of empowerment, the result is not strength, but exhaustion. This is particularly evident among women who have invested heavily in careers only to find that professional success does not replace emotional security or shared purpose. Men, for their part, are not immune to this strain, but they are responding differently. Rather than seeking institutional validation, many are opting for minimalism in both lifestyle and relationships. Fewer possessions, fewer obligations, fewer entanglements. This makes them less visible, less predictable, and harder to reach. From the outside, it can look like disengagement. From the inside, it feels like control. As these patterns solidify, the gap between expectation and reality grows wider. Women were told that men would adjust endlessly, that standards would soften, and that time was forgiving. Men were told that adapting was a moral obligation. Neither message accounted for fatigue. People do not adapt forever without benefit. Eventually, they choose peace over participation. This is why appeals to emotion are no longer working. Calls for empathy without accountability fall flat. Requests for engagement without reciprocity go unanswered. The social contract has been strained to the point where it must either be renegotiated honestly or quietly abandoned. What we are witnessing now is the latter happening in slow motion. It is also important to understand that this withdrawal is selective, not universal. Men have not abandoned cooperation entirely, they have narrowed it. Trust is extended within smaller circles where behavior is consistent and expectations are clear. Outside those circles, interaction is transactional and unlimited. You know, this creates an uneven social terrain where access depends on perceived risk rather than shared identity. For women accustomed to broad inclusion, this shift feels like exclusion. For men, it feels like survival. The long term implications of this are profound. Societies rely on cooperation between sexes to function smoothly. When that cooperation breaks down, everything becomes harder. Birth rates fall, care networks weaken, economic productivity slows, social trust erodes. These outcomes are not ideological, they are mechanical. You can argue about causes, but you cannot argue with results. What makes the current moment particularly fragile is that many of the buffers that once softened these effects are gone. Extended families live far apart. Community organizations struggle to retain members. Informal mentorship has declined. When individuals encounter hardship, there are fewer places to turn. In this vacuum, centralized solutions expand, often framed as progress, but experienced as constraint. Women, having been encouraged to trust these systems, are often surprised by their limits. Assistance is conditional, support is temporary, autonomy is negotiated. The realization that systems cannot replace human bonds comes late, often after options have narrowed. This is not because women are incapable of foresight, but because foresight was discouraged in favor of optimism. Men, having learned from earlier disillusionment, are less likely to place faith in promises. They look for leverage, redundancy, and exit strategies. This difference in approach further widens the gap between expectation and reality. When one side plans for permanence and the other plans for contingency, alignment becomes difficult. The question many people ask at this point is whether reconciliation is possible. The answer is complicated. It depends on willingness to abandon comforting myths and accept uncomfortable truths. It requires acknowledging that not all choices are reversible and that equality does not mean interchangeability. It requires rebuilding respect, not through demands, but through demonstrated reliability and shared responsibility. For some, this adjustment will come in time. For others, it will not. Demographic and economic trends suggest that a significant portion of the population will age without partners, children, or strong community ties. This is not presented here as a threat, but as a reality that carries consequences. Loneliness is not just an emotional state, it has economic, health, and social costs that ripple outward. As these costs accumulate, pressure on systems will increase. Governments will struggle to support aging populations without family support structures. Healthcare systems will face increased demand. Social services will be stretched thin. In this environment, those with personal networks will fare better than those without. This is not favoritism, it is physics. Men, having opted out of many traditional roles, will not automatically be pulled back in by crisis. Trust once broken is slow to rebuild. Engagement once abandoned is not easily rekindled. Appeals to duty ring hollow when duty was framed as oppression for decades. Any attempt to reverse course must start with honesty rather than nostalgia. What we are seeing now is not the end of cooperation between men and women, but the end of cooperation based on denial. The next phase will be defined by clarity, clear expectations, clear boundaries, clear trade offs. Those who adapt to this reality will build smaller but more resilient lives. Those who cling to narratives that promised everything without cost will struggle. When you observe daily life closely, you can see this transformation playing out in small, almost invisible ways. It is not announced, it is not debated openly, it simply manifests in behavior. Men spend less time in public social spaces and more time in controlled environments. They socialize less broadly and more selectively. They invest energy into skills that increase independence rather than into relationships that introduce uncertainty. Women, meanwhile, increasingly occupy public spaces that once relied on male participation. Yet those spaces feel emptier, quieter, and less alive. What used to feel like anticipation now feels like waiting. This change in atmosphere is not accidental. Social spaces are ecosystems. They depend on participation, exchange, and mutual expectation. When one group withdraws, the entire environment shifts. Cafes, gyms, bookstores, and social venues no longer function as meeting points, but as holding areas where people exist side by side without interaction. The energy is different. Conversations are shorter. Eye contact is rarer. Everyone is guarded, even when they cannot explain why. At the individual level, people adapt to this new normal by lowering expectations. Women tell themselves they are content alone while quietly hoping for connection that never materializes. Men tell themselves they prefer solitude while recognizing that isolation is the price of peace. Both narratives are coping mechanisms. They make the present tolerable, but they do not address the underlying fracture. Over time, these coping strategies harden into identity, making reversal even more difficult. What is rarely acknowledged is how quickly social skills atrophy when they are not used. Initiating conversation, reading cues, navigating disagreement, and repairing misunderstandings are learned behaviors. When interaction declines, so does competence. This creates a vicious cycle where people feel less capable of connecting, which leads to further withdrawal, which reinforces the belief that connection is too difficult or risky to pursue. Loneliness becomes normalized, even as it quietly corrodes well being. Another overlooked factor is how technology amplifies this disconnection. Digital communication offers convenience but strips away nuance. Algorithms reward outrage and validation over understanding. People are exposed to extreme narratives that confirm existing fears while obscuring everyday reality. Women see content suggesting endless options and validation, while men see content warning of risk and loss. Both are fed selective truths that deepen mistrust rather than encourage balance. In this environment, expectations drift further apart. Women wait to be chosen, believing that visibility equals value. Men wait for clear signals, believing that ambiguity equals danger. The result is paralysis. Opportunities for connection pass unnoticed, not because people lack desire, but because the rules feel unclear and the stakes feel high. Silence becomes the safest response, even when it guarantees nothing will change. As years pass, this stagnation takes a toll. Milestones that once marked progress fade without replacement. There's no shared rhythm to life stages, no collective sense of moving forward together. People age, but their lives do not feel fuller. Experiences accumulate without coherence. Memories exist without continuity. This is not freedom. It is drift disguised as choice. Economic pressure intensifies these feelings. Without shared households or pooled resources, costs rise. Individuals shoulder burdens that were once distributed. Housing becomes smaller. Leisure becomes rarer. Health suffers under stress. When something goes wrong, there is no immediate safety net. Systems exist, but they are slow, impersonal, and conditional. The realization that independence offers no guarantee of security arrives gradually, often after options have narrowed. Men, having anticipated this instability earlier, often structure their lives to minimize exposure. They save aggressively, they limit obligations, they avoid commitments that cannot be exited cleanly. This makes them resilient, but also distant. From the outside, it can appear cold. From the inside, it feels necessary. Women encountering this distance may interpret it as rejection rather than self preservation, further widening misunderstanding. What complicates matters is that many women are not seeking dominance or control. They are seeking reassurance, partnership, and stability. The problem is that the language used to demand these things has been shaped by decades of messaging that framed men as obstacles rather than allies. When appeals are made through accusation rather than invitation, they fail to resonate. Men do not respond to blame with generosity, they respond by stepping back. At the same time, men often underestimate how disorienting this shift has been for women. Being told for years that everything is possible, only to discover limits later in life, is destabilizing. It creates grief for futures imagined but never realized. That grief is real, even if the narratives that produced it were flawed. Ignoring that pain does not make it disappear. It simply pushes it into quieter, more destructive forms. This is why the current moment feels so tense and unresolved. Both sides feel wronged, but in different ways. Women feel misled and abandoned. Men feel blamed and exploited. Institutions exploit this tension by positioning themselves as arbiters and protectors, offering solutions that increase dependence while promising relief. The more fractured society becomes, the more authority concentrates at the center. History shows where this leads. When people lose faith in each other, they trade freedom for security. They accept oversight in exchange for predictability. They surrender autonomy to systems that promise order. These systems do not require trust, they require compliance. Over time, compliance replaces cooperation as the dominant social mechanism. This is efficient, but it is brittle. When systems fail, there is nothing underneath to catch the fall. Men sense this brittleness and adjust accordingly. They value portability, flexibility, and exit options. They build lives that can be moved, downsized, or reconfigured quickly. Women, having been encouraged to invest deeply in specific paths, often find themselves less flexible when disruption occurs. This asymmetry creates further imbalance in relationships and negotiations. As these patterns solidify, cultural narratives lag behind reality. Media continues to promote ideals that no longer align with lived experience. Success stories are highlighted while struggles are minimized. People compare themselves to curated images rather than honest data. This fuels dissatisfaction and self doubt, especially among women who did everything they were told would lead to fulfillment. The hardest realization for many is that there is no villain pulling strings. There is no single moment where everything went wrong. There were only incentives and responses repeated over time until they formed a new equilibrium. That equilibrium is less cooperative, less trusting, and more fragmented than before. Changing it requires deliberate effort and mutual adjustment, not slogans or nostalgia. Some individuals will manage this adjustment successfully. They will recalibrate expectations early enough to build meaningful connections. They will prioritize stability over status and cooperation over performance. Others will struggle, clinging to narratives that promise validation without change. The difference will not be intelligence or effort, but timing and honesty. Men who choose to re engage will do so selectively. They will look for consistency rather than intensity, reliability rather than excitement. They will value peace over drama and contribution over rhetoric. Women who align with these priorities will find opportunities that others miss, not because they lowered standards, but because they clarified them. This does not mean returning to the past. It means acknowledging that progress without balance creates instability. Independence without interdependence leads to isolation. Choice without consequence leads to regret. These are not moral judgments. They are observations drawn from patterns repeating across cultures and economies. As this transition continues, more people will sense that something fundamental has shifted, even if they cannot articulate it. Conversations will feel different. Expectations will feel misaligned. The future will feel uncertain in ways that optimism alone cannot resolve. Those who confront this reality directly will be better equipped to navigate it. Those who deny it will feel increasingly disoriented. When people talk about loneliness today, they often treat it as an emotional issue rather than a structural one. But loneliness is rarely about feelings alone. It is the byproduct of systems that no longer encourage durable bonds. When individuals are told to prioritize personal advancement above all else, relationships become optional rather than foundational. Optional things are the first to be postponed when life becomes busy. And when they are postponed long enough, they quietly disappear. What remains is not freedom, but a vacuum that people struggle to name. Aging without strong relational anchors changes the texture of life in ways that are hard to explain until they are experienced. Milestones lose their meaning when there is no one to share them with. Achievements feel hollow without witnesses who genuinely care. Challenges feel heavier and bawas when there is no one to lean on. This is not sentimentality, it is how humans are wired. Shared experience gives life continuity. Without it, time feels fragmented and days blur together. Many women discover this gradually as social circles shrink. Friends pair off, relocate, or become consumed by responsibilities that no longer overlap. Work relationships remain polite but shallow. Digital connections provide noise but not nourishment. There is constant interaction without intimacy, constant communication without depth. Over time, this creates a sense of invisibility that no amount of self affirmation can fix. Men experience a different version of this same reality. Their withdrawal often brings quiet and control, but also distance. They may enjoy reduced conflict and greater autonomy, yet still feel the absence of meaningful companionship. The difference is that many men accept this trade consciously. They see solitude as the cost of stability. Women are more likely to feel that something was taken from them rather than traded away because the long term cost was never framed clearly. As people move into later stages of life, these differences become more pronounced. Health concerns increase, energy declines, the margin for error shrinks. Tasks that once felt manageable alone become burdensome. Without a partner or close family, even small setbacks feel overwhelming. This is where the limits of institutional support become obvious. Systems can process requests, but they cannot replace presence. They cannot sit with you in uncertainty. They cannot adapt intuitively to your needs. They offer solutions, not care. This is why societies that lose family cohesion often experience rising demand for professional services to replace what was once informal support. Care becomes commodified, companionship becomes scheduled, assistance becomes transactional. These services are helpful, but they are expensive and impersonal. They are substitutes, not equivalents. Over time, reliance on them deepens dependency rather than resilience. Men, anticipating this future, often structure their lives to avoid entanglement with systems that cannot be trusted to prioritize individual well being. They invest in self sufficiency. They learn practical skills. They reduce reliance on external validation. This does not make them immune to hardship, but it does make them less exposed. Women, having been encouraged to trust systems as partners, often find themselves more entangled when those systems change rules or retract support. Another aspect that becomes unavoidable with age is legacy. People want to feel that their lives mattered beyond their own comfort. They want continuity, impact, and memory. For many, this is expressed through children, mentorship, or community contribution. When these avenues are absent, people search for substitutes. Careers, hobbies, and causes can provide partial fulfillment, but they rarely satisfy the deeper desire to be part of something enduring. This is where regret enters the conversation, not as a dramatic breakdown, but as a quiet background presence. Regret is not always about choices made. Often it is about choices deferred until they were no longer available. It is the realization that some decisions have windows and those windows do not wait for certainty. The tragedy is not that people made mistakes, it is that they were told mistakes did not exist. Culturally, there's resistance to acknowledging this because it challenges deeply held narratives. Admitting that some paths are time sensitive feels restrictive, it feels unfair. But reality does not negotiate. Ignoring constraints does not remove them. It only ensures they will be encountered later, when adaptation is harder. Men, watching this unfold, become even more cautious about re entering traditional roles. They do not want to be emergency solutions for problems they were previously blamed for. They are wary of being asked to provide stability without respect or partnership. As a result, re engagement happens slowly and selectively, if at all. This reinforces the sense among many women that men have disappeared, when in reality, they have simply stopped advertising their presence. The social consequences of this dynamic extend beyond individuals. Communities lose continuity when fewer families form. Neighborhoods become transient, schools shrink, local traditions fade. When fewer people have long term stakes in a place, collective responsibility weakens. People become consumers of space rather than caretakers of it. This further erodes trust and belonging. Economically, aging populations without family support strain public resources. Care demands rise while the pool of informal caregivers shrinks. Taxes increase. Benefits are rationed. Younger generations face heavier burdens, creating resentment and division. None of this is hypothetical. It is already visible in multiple countries grappling with demographic imbalance. What is striking is how predictable this trajectory was. Demographers, economists, and sociologists warned about declining birth rates and delayed family formation for decades. The warnings were dismissed as outdated or alarmist. Optimism was preferred to preparation. Now, as projections become reality, there is little appetite for accountability. Instead, there is confusion about why systems feel stretched and why individuals feel unsupported. The answer is not to shame anyone. Shame does not rebuild structures. The answer is to tell the truth about trade offs and timing so future generations can make informed choices. But telling that truth is difficult in a culture that equates limitation with oppression. It requires maturity to accept that freedom includes responsibility and that not all options remain open indefinitely. For individuals still navigating these choices, clarity matters more than reassurance. Understanding incentives allows better decisions. Recognizing patterns helps avoid repeating them. This is not about returning to rigid roles. It is about aligning expectations with reality so cooperation becomes possible again. Men who choose partnership in this environment will do so with clear boundaries and criteria. They will look for alignment rather than persuasion. Women who understand this will approach relationships differently, emphasizing reliability, contribution, and mutual respect over performance or entitlement. This shift will not be universal, but it will define the relationships that endure. Those who do not adapt will increasingly rely on external validation and institutional support to fill the void left by missing personal bonds. This path offers stability of a kind, but it is fragile. Systems change, policies shift, resources fluctuate. When support is conditional, security is temporary. As this reality becomes more visible, cultural narratives will slowly adjust. Stories of endless independence will give way to stories of interdependence. The value of cooperation will be rediscovered, not as obligation, but as survival strategy. Those who move early will have more options. Those who wait for consensus will find that time has already decided. The most important thing to understand is that this transition is not sudden, it is cumulative. Every year of delay compounds its effects. Every assumption left unchallenged increases future difficulty. The sooner individuals confront these truths, the more agency they retain. Rebuilding trust in an environment like this does not happen through grand gestures or sweeping cultural reforms. It happens quietly, locally, and slowly, often beneath the surface of mainstream conversation. Large scale solutions struggle because they are impersonal. They assume uniform motivations and ignore individual risk. People do not rebuild trust because they are told to. They rebuild it when incentives align and when experience confirms that doing so is safe. This is why attempts to engineer connection from the top down consistently fail. Trust is not a policy outcome, it is an earned condition. For men, trust begins with predictability. They want to know that effort will not be punished, that boundaries will be respected, and that responsibility will be shared rather than weaponized. After years of mixed signals and shifting expectations, many men have learned to default to caution. They are not closed off entirely, but they are selective. They watch behavior over time rather than listening to promises. They respond to consistency rather than intensity. This filters out chaos, but it also reduces spontaneity, making connection harder to initiate. Women who adapt to this reality tend to do so by adjusting how they signal interest and commitment. Instead of waiting passively or relying on visibility alone, they emphasize reliability, cooperation, and clarity. They reduce ambiguity. They communicate intentions without performance or testing. This is not submission. It is alignment. It recognizes that in a low trust environment, transparency is more attractive than excitement. These women often find opportunities others miss, not because they are different in value, but because they are different in approach. On the other hand, women who cling to older narratives struggle more with this shift. They wait for engagement that no longer comes automatically. They interpret male caution as rejection rather than prudence. They seek reassurance from systems that cannot provide it, mistaking procedural support for genuine care. Over time, frustration builds, and frustration hardens into resentment. This resentment then becomes visible to others, further discouraging connection. The cycle reinforces itself. Men also face a choice in this environment. Total withdrawal offers safety. But it also limits growth. Selective engagement requires effort and vulnerability, even if reduced. Some men will remain disengaged permanently, content with autonomy and low exposure. Others will re enter cautiously, forming partnerships that are narrower but deeper. The difference lies in perceived risk versus perceived reward. When reward is framed realistically rather than idealistically, engagement becomes possible again. What neither side can afford anymore is denial. Denial wastes time, and time is the scarcest resource in this equation. The longer people operate on outdated assumptions, the fewer options remain. This is especially true for those who believe that waiting itself is a strategy. Waiting only works when conditions improve on their own. Right now, conditions are not improving automatically, they are hardening. The failure of large scale cultural messaging becomes obvious when you compare rhetoric to lived experience. People are told they are freer than ever, yet feel more constrained. They are told they are more connected, yet feel more alone. They are told they have endless choice, yet feel trapped by past decisions. This disconnect erodes trust not just between individuals, but between individuals and culture itself. When culture stops reflecting reality, people stop listening. As a result, many are turning inward. They curate their influences, they disengage from mainstream narratives, they build personal philosophies based on observation rather than instruction. This decentralization of belief mirrors the decentralization of social life. Authority shifts from institutions to experience. People trust what they see more than what they are told. This is a rational response, but it also fragments shared understanding. In fragmented societies, small groups become more important than large identities. Loyalty is local, trust is conditional, cooperation is negotiated case by case. This favors those who can adapt quickly and communicate clearly. It disadvantages those who rely on assumed goodwill or inherited norms. The rules have changed, even if no one announced it officially. Women navigating this environment successfully often do so by prioritizing stability early rather than chasing validation. They recognize that attention is not the same as commitment and that visibility does not guarantee support. They invest in relationships that demonstrate follow through. They value peace over performance. This approach does not eliminate risk, but it reduces it significantly. Men who choose partnership look for the same qualities. They are less interested in being needed and more interested in being respected. They want to build something durable rather than dramatic. They avoid situations where they are expected to compensate for systemic failures or past decisions they did not make. When these expectations align, cooperation becomes possible again, even in a fractured landscape. The broader society, however, continues to struggle with this adjustment. Policies are still built on outdated assumptions about family structure, labor participation, and social cohesion. When outcomes diverge from projections, the response is often more regulation rather than reevaluation. This adds friction without addressing root causes. People feel managed rather than supported, which increases disengagement. This tension is particularly visible around aging. As populations grow older without corresponding family networks, demand for institutional care increases. At the same time, trust in those institutions declines. People fear dependency but lack alternatives. This fear shapes behavior long before care is needed. Individuals make conservative choices, limit exposure, and hoard resources. Cooperation becomes transactional rather than relational. Men, having internalized this risk early, often appear ahead of the curve. Women, having been encouraged to trust systems longer, feel blindsided when those systems reveal their limits. This difference in timing creates friction in relationships, negotiations, and expectations. One side feels cautious, the other feels urgent. Bridging that gap requires empathy and realism on both sides, but empathy alone is not enough. Incentives must align. The path forward is narrower than it once was, but it still exists. It runs through smaller commitments, clear expectations, and shared responsibility. It requires abandoning the idea that fulfillment is automatic or guaranteed. It requires accepting that stability is built deliberately and maintained actively. This is not romantic, but it is effective. And those who succeed in this environment will not be those who are loudest or most visible. They will be those who are consistent. They will build lives that are quieter but more resilient. They will value cooperation without illusion and independence without isolation. They will understand that freedom without structure collapses into chaos, and structure without consent collapses into control. For those still deciding how to move forward, the most important shift is internal. It is the move from expectation to evaluation. Instead of asking what should happen, ask what is happening. Instead of waiting for permission, look for patterns. Instead of trusting narratives, trust results. This mindset does not guarantee success, but it preserves agency. As this transition continues, more people will feel the pressure to choose. Passive drifting will become less viable. Economic constraints, social fragmentation, and time will force decisions that were once optional. Those decisions will shape not just personal outcomes, but the character of society itself. The economic dimension of this crisis ties everything together because money exposes reality in ways ideology cannot hide. Work has changed, stability has eroded. Careers that once promised predictability now demand constant adaptation. Automation, outsourcing, and restructuring have transformed employment into something far more fragile than it appears on paper. In this environment, financial independence is promoted as the ultimate safeguard. Yet independence without shared responsibility quickly becomes isolation under pressure. When income fluctuates, costs rise, and safety nets weaken, individuals without strong personal alliances feel the strain first and most intensely. Women were encouraged to see work as both identity and security, but work was never designed to carry that weight alone. Jobs end, industries shift, health interrupts plans. When a career becomes the primary source of meaning and stability, its failure leaves a void that cannot be filled quickly. Men, having experienced earlier disillusionment with institutions, often treat work as a tool rather than an identity. They diversify skills, reduce lifestyle overhead, and prepare for volatility. This difference in framing creates divergent outcomes when disruption occurs. Economic stress magnifies relational fractures. When people are financially stretched, patience declines. Tolerance for uncertainty disappears. Small disagreements escalate because there is no margin for error. In past generations, shared households and pooled resources softened these pressures. Today, many individuals face them alone. This accelerates burnout and deepens resentment, especially when people feel they did everything they were told and still ended up insecure. The promise that technology would free people from hardship has also proven incomplete. While efficiency has increased, competition has intensified. Productivity gains benefit systems faster than individuals. Those without leverage feel replaceable. In this environment, people cling to whatever gives them a sense of control, whether that is independence, withdrawal, or rigid ideology. None of these fully solve the underlying problem, which is the erosion of trust and cooperation. Men, watching economic volatility increase, often double down on self preservation. They avoid financial entanglements that could expose them to long term risk. They hesitate to commit to arrangements that depend on optimistic assumptions. This caution is not rooted in cruelty, it is rooted in observation. When systems fail, responsibility does not disappear. it transfers. Men have learned to be wary of being the default backstop. Women, on the other hand, are often encouraged to believe that fairness will be enforced externally. When that enforcement falls short, frustration grows. Appeals to justice replace negotiation. Expectations collide with reality. This dynamic strains relationships further, making cooperation feel adversarial rather than collaborative. Over time, both sides retreat into defensiveness even when their underlying desires are similar. The result is a population that appears busy and accomplished, yet feels chronically depleted. People work harder but feel less secure. They achieve more but feel less satisfied. They have more freedom on paper but less peace in practice. This contradiction is not accidental. It is the outcome of systems that prioritize output over cohesion and narratives that prioritize empowerment over preparation. What is missing is not opportunity, but alignment. Alignment between effort and outcome, between expectation and reality, between individual goals and shared responsibility. Without alignment, progress becomes exhausting rather than fulfilling. People run faster just to stay in place, wondering why success feels hollow. This is why many men are opting out of conventional definitions of success altogether. They downsize ambitions. They reject constant competition. They focus on autonomy rather than status. This makes them less visible in traditional metrics, but more resilient internally. Women observing this shift may misinterpret it as disengagement from life itself, when it is often disengagement from systems that no longer deliver proportional reward. The danger moving forward is that society continues to treat these symptoms rather than causes. More incentives, more programs, more messaging, all layered on top of a foundation that is already cracked. Without rebuilding trust between individuals, none of these measures restore cohesion. They simply manage decline more efficiently. The future will likely be defined by parallel paths. One path relies increasingly on centralized systems, regulation, and oversight to compensate for weakened personal bonds. The other path relies on smaller networks, selective cooperation, and decentralized resilience. Neither path will be perfect, but one offers adaptability while the other offers control. People will choose based on temperament, experience, and opportunity. Women who recognize this early can still reposition. By prioritizing stability over performance, cooperation over validation, and long term partnership over short term affirmation, they increase their chances of building durable lives. Men who choose to re engage can do so without surrendering boundaries, contributing where trust exists rather than where obligation is demanded. These choices are not ideological, they are practical. The hardest truth is that no one is coming to fix this for us. There will be no cultural reset that restores trust overnight, no policy that replaces personal accountability, no narrative that erases trade offs. The work of rebuilding happens one decision at a time, one relationship at a time, under conditions that are far less forgiving than before. For many, the window for certain outcomes has narrowed or closed. That reality is painful, but ignoring it only increases suffering. Acceptance is not surrender. It is the starting point for realistic adaptation. People who accept constraints regain agency within them. People who deny constraints lose agency entirely. This is not about assigning blame, it is about understanding cause and effect. Systems respond to incentives, people respond to risk. When those dynamics are ignored, outcomes worsen. When they are understood, even difficult environments can be navigated with intention rather than desperation. As this transition continues, more people will feel the tension between what they were promised and what is available. Some will cling to promise and grow bitter. Others will adjust expectations and find stability in smaller, quieter ways. The difference will not be luck, it will be honesty. Men walking away was never about hostility toward women. It was about walking away from a system that punished contribution and blurred responsibility. Women now face a crossroads of their own. Continue trusting narratives that no longer align with reality, or recalibrate toward cooperation, foresight, and grounded decision making. Neither path is easy, but one preserves the possibility of partnership. The coming years will reward those who act deliberately rather than react emotionally, who observe patterns rather than chase reassurance, who value peace over applause and stability over spectacle. This is not a call to retreat from life. It is a call to engage with it honestly, without illusions that make disappointment inevitable. If there is one lesson to take from everything discussed, it is this: freedom without responsibility collapses. Independence without interdependence isolates. Choice without consequence deceives. The future belongs to those who understand these truths early enough to act on them. I want to know what you think about everything we discussed here. Do you agree with this assessment, or do you see it differently? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts and experiences, because these conversations matter more now than ever. Like the video if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.